Well, good afternoon and welcome to the principal's office. My name is Principal Edward Gordon. And this afternoon, I have a special guest, Ms. Karen Dudek Brannon. Good afternoon.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for being on the show. And I want to start off with a brief introduction of Ms. Brannon. Karen Dudek Brannon is a professional development and product specialist, speech language pathologist, and founder and CEO of Dr. Karen LLC, a company focused on empowering therapists and educators to design interventions that support language, literacy, and executive functioning. She develops engaging professional development and products that help school teams work together to get better results. Through her courses and trainings, as well as the De facto Leaders podcast, Dr. Branning shares up to date evidence based practices, her own experience, and guest interviews designed to help pediatric therapists, educators, and aspiring school leaders design services that support social, emotional, and academic growth and set kids up for success in adulthood. Whether you want to learn effective strategies for your therapy session or classroom, be an influential leader on your team, or find creative ways to use your skills to advance in your career, Dr. Branning has got you covered. You can listen to the De facto Leaders podcast on most popular podcast directories. Let's welcome to the show again, Dr. Karen Dudek Brannon.
All right. Well, thank you for having me here.
All right. I'm glad you were here. Let's just start off by tell the audience your story. How did you get into the work that you're doing right now?
Oh, like everyone, it's been quite the journey. Definitely not when I look back at when I started my career, would not have thought that I'd be doing what I'm doing right now. So I did start off as a speech pathologist. I was in the schools for 14 years and at the time was working on my doctorate in special ed and getting my director of special ed credentials. So I originally thought I wanted to do either higher ed or be a special ed director. And I still am very involved in school leadership, but during that time when I was, finishing my doctorate and figuring out what I wanted to do next, I was always doing a number of different side projects. I like to call them micro experiments. So, just trying things out to see what I liked and sort of building up this portfolio of experiences to just kind of, again, do a lot of test runs. So there's adjunct assignments, leadership projects while I was working in the schools. But one thing that really took off towards the end of my doctoral program is that I started to create courses and products for speech pathologists and other people who were working on intervention teams and supporting language and literacy, because that was really an area where within speech pathology, there's a lot of areas where people commonly think of where it's, a child who's having an issue with a sound error or someone who stutters. Those are things that you commonly think of when you think a speech pathologist. But actually, when you're in the schools, a large portion of your caseload, actually about half of the kids that I had on my caseload were more the language literacy, vocabulary, having issues with reading and just overall academic issues. And I did not feel like I had a framework for that. And it was always an area that I struggled with, especially my first few years. And I felt like I was kind of guessing and throwing things together. So that is what I ended up specializing in during my doctoral work. But when I was finished with my research, that's where I started creating courses and programs, because it was something that I wished that I would have had back when I first started. So my first course and my first suite of products that I created was around language and literacy, mostly for speech pathologists. So back in 2014, that actually took off before my job search took off. So I started creating products and services on the side while I was working in the school, and eventually built that up to create a whole suite of products. And so I left the schools in 2018 to focus on that full time. And so that's what I've been doing since then. And I started off with really just focused on the literacy piece, but I've expanded to also focus on things like executive functioning. So obviously, executive functioning impacts all of the academic areas, including the literacy, but it has such a global impact on other areas of your life as well, like your ability to form relationships, your ability to function in a vocational or just basic day-to-day things. So I've expanded from that original focus that I had, which was just focusing on speech pathologists, and really am now focusing on supporting the entire IEP team, but really specifically those related service providers. So obviously the speech pathologists, the psychologists, the social workers, the counselors, anybody who's doing some kind of specialized services can really play a part in providing that executive functioning support. So I do provide support in those specific areas, but also just the leadership training and the skills that you need to help your team work together. So that's what I do in my company, and that's really what I'm focusing on right now.
Very good. Can you share with the audience what is the process to become a speech language pathologist?
So you do have to have a master's degree, and you do have to have a license. So back in the day, a long time ago, you could get licensed with a bachelor's degree, but now you need either an MS or an MA. So obviously a master's degree. And so how it works is that, so you go to school, you typically would major in something like communication sciences and disorders. My degree was called speech pathology and audiology for my bachelor's. And then you have to get into grad school, which is very competitive and also for a lot of people, very expensive. So once you finish your master's degree, what that involves is typically coursework. And then a lot of times you do some clinical hours on campus. So it's similar to what you would do with student teaching, but it's just therapy, and you're supervised by someone who is licensed. And so you get a number of hours on campus, but what typically people do is that after they finish their coursework on campus, they do a clinical externship, which is similar to student teaching. And every program is a little bit different. The way that my program worked was that I had to do one in a medical setting. So I did one in a hospital. I was mostly working with adults who had had strokes, brain injuries, dementia, people who had aphasia. I also worked with people who had difficulty swallowing. That was actually the majority of what I worked with adults. Then I went and I did a school placement where I was working with kids in an elementary school. And so that was students with sound errors, students who stuttered, and again, a lot of students with language and literacy issues, students with autism, ADHD. And so that was my school placement. So you just have to make sure you get enough adult hours and enough pediatric hours. And then once you do that, you get a job, and then you do what's called a clinical fellowship. So you can get a job and start working, but you're not licensed yet. So usually at that point, you can apply for your state board of education license for your state, but you're not technically licensed yet in your for your medical license and for your national license, which I guess if you compared it to teachers, is probably similar to your national boards. But what you have to do to get those licenses on top of your school license is that you have to be supervised for another 9 months. And so that's called a clinical fellowship. Again, similar to maybe what a doctor would be doing during their residency, where they're getting paid, but they're not official yet. So after that, you have to make sure that you pass. There's an exam that you have to pass. And then once you've done your exam, you've done your clinical fellowship, you have your master's degree, then you can apply for your national license and your state license. And then there's, again, the continuing education requirements similar to what teachers have to do, except you have to think about being licensed in 3 different places. So there's school, medical, and then national. So yeah, a lot of times districts, technically, they just want you to have your school license, but some of them are saying, hey, we want you to have this as well. But typically a lot of people just want all 3 just because they want to make sure that they're versatile. Sometimes people like to do hours at a medical setting over the summer if they're going to work in the schools, or they just want to have the option to switch. So lots of different places and continuing education boards to think about.
Yeah, there's two things as you were going through this whole sequence of what it takes to become a speech language pathologist. First of all, I have a 20-year-old son who's on the spectrum for autism. And of course, throughout the years, he has been working with speech pathologists, therapists, and so forth. And I never really took the opportunity to really learn about what
Yeah.
they had to do in terms of education to be in that position. That's the first thing. And the second thing, when you're talking about the sequence and everything that you have to do, the
Yep.
tests and so forth, you definitely have to have a passion for that work to be able to go through everything, to be able to accomplish what you need to be certified as a speech language pathologist. But I would say, I know that the audience is going to be thinking about this as well. But for me, here, just listening to what it takes is definitely, I have a new respect for those that
Appreciate
are
that.
in that role. Definitely. Well, I wanted to ask, I know that you're doing some work, you do work with child study teams, and you've been a part of teams as well. But through your experiences, what do you believe is an important component or characteristics of a successful child study team?
Oh, there's so many things, but there's, I mean, the support really has to come from all angles, and the ownership and the responsibility has to come from all angles. And so I work a lot with the therapists on the team, and I know that a lot of times they feel like they're not a part of the team, they're not included, they don't get invited to these meetings or these conversations. But what I usually encourage people to do is to be thinking of themselves as, understanding their role in their area of expertise and feeling confident in that, but also seeing how all these parts fit together. When the way that I mentor clinicians a lot of times is, if I'm working with speech pathologists, for example, and they're in their very first year and they're feeling super overwhelmed, there are certain things that they might have that are kind of this immediate thing that they need to feel confident in order to kind of level up in the way that they think about their role in their career. So, for example, if I had a speech pathologist who was so overwhelmed with the language therapy aspect, I would say, let's give you a protocol for this so you feel comfortable with this. But then once team members get comfortable and you get that initial learning curve under your belt, and this could apply to other disciplines as well, where it's, let's get you comfortable with your individual role. And then once you get comfortable, let's help you to figure out how you can be a better team member and a better leader. And then I kind of shift their focus to, what do I do when I have a student in front of me, to what does this student need globally on the team? And what are all of the different things that need to be done as far as planning service delivery? And then how does that inform what I do? Because a lot of times, what will happen is that with therapists, they're kind of thinking about, well, what do I do? Like, what's my role in this process? And I often say to them, there is a role. You do have your area of expertise, but you also have to figure out how you fit into the way that the team works at your school. Because sometimes how something works at one school and how the responsibilities are divvied up is different to another school. So one example would be that I could think of that is just like a very specific thing that comes up with speech pathologists, is that they, with the literacy piece, it affects so many different areas, and it gets kind of confusing where it's, okay, what does the psychologist do over here? And what does the reading specialist do? And what's the general education and the special ed teacher? And then what's left over for the speech pathologist to do? And it gets really confusing. So it's sometimes hard for me to say, well, this is what you have to do, because I don't know how your team works. So what I encourage people to do is, yes, understand the role and the framework, but really understand all the pieces that need to go together in order for a plan to work. And then figure out, okay, what are all the pieces and who's doing what? And then let that decide what you do when you have a student in front of you. And the way that has to happen is that the team has to be working together really well. And you have to be able to come together and say, here are all the things that this student needs or this group of students need, and how are we going to divvy up the responsibilities so everything is being done. And what I often share for a lot of the therapists is that I say, here's what's within your scope professionally. Here's what you're qualified to do. But just because you're qualified to do this doesn't mean you're the only person that could be qualified to do this. And if you know that this is a gap in your team, what you could be doing is you could be getting, forming a relationship with someone else on the team and consulting and coaching them so that you can take your expertise and inform what they're doing. So you're coming together and kind of dividing up what needs to be done for the students. So you don't have to feel like you have to do it all on your own, because that's a lot of times what people feel like when they're siloed off like that, where it's like, I have to get to all of these skills and I have to get to all of these things in my sessions. And I'm saying, no, you don't. You could train somebody else. You can share your skills and your knowledge with someone else. And now you've taken what you know and you've spread it out so that when that student leaves your room, they have all the support in all these other areas. So that's what I really encourage people to do, because there is a lot of overlapping in scope with a lot of these skills that need to be addressed. So people do need to understand their area of expertise, and they need to understand the value of the other people's expertise on their team so that they can all work together.
So, well, thank you for sharing that information and that framework in terms of we all have these specialties within the team, and it's a matter for us to understand that, and also how it all fits together in the best interest of the students, and to be able to make sure that we're providing that proper services and support for them as they're advancing. So that's great information for any of our childhood team members that are listening to the broadcast. So I wanted to just change up a little bit and just share with the audience what's something fun about Dr. Brannon.
Oh yeah, let me think here. Where could I go with this? So this is just sort of a random fact. So I'm a runner. I've been involved in sports my whole life. I really have been involved in endurance sports really through my adulthood. I was a swimmer as a child, and so that is something that has been a big part of my life. And also I think it's just, as far as just being resilient and knowing how to work through challenges, there's nothing that does that more than having to just do this repetitive activity over and over again when you're feeling uncomfortable. I mean, how many people do you know that hate doing cardio? And so, but one of the things that I wanted to share is that, so back when I was so it would have been when I was in grad school, right before my clinicals, I was was a swimmer, and then I started getting into running when I was in grad school, and I had never been on any kind of track team or anything when I was younger. My sister had, and she always was like, like one of these days I'll do a marathon. And I was kind of like, no. So when I was in grad school, my sisters and then a bunch of my friends decided they were going to do the Chicago Marathon. And so I was like, well, if you guys can do it, I can do it too. And it just didn't occur to me to like try a 5K or something. I was just like, nope, I'm going to just start with a marathon. So I got into running after that and started doing shorter distances after that because I realized I was good at it. But yeah, so that's kind of my random how I got into running, is that I just started with a marathon. I didn't think, let's work your way up. I just sort of jumped right in. And I've done that with a lot of things in my life where it's like, let's just go all in. Let's do the hardest thing first. Yeah. It's kind of like, when you at those pools where they have the high dives, where it's like the high dive and then the 5 meter and then the 8 meter and then the 10 meter. And my philosophy is just go up to the 10 meter because they're all scary. You might as well just, start at the top and work your way down.
I would tell you, I am learning a lot of things about you and from you about the work you're doing. And I'm not too sure if I'm going to go running with you for the first
Yeah. Well, that it doesn't apply for everything,
time.
but in certain aspects, it's kind of like if it takes just as much work to go big as it does to, do these other increments, just go big, you know?
Go big. Understood. So as you would think about it in terms of your life, I believe strongly in the importance of either well both having a coach and as well as a mentor.
Mhm.
Can you just share if you have a coach and a mentor, and also like what's one lesson that you learned from that coach or mentor that has really impacted your life?
I have had lots of coaches and mentors, and I will continue to have lots of them come in and out of my life. And, I think that there's sometimes when you need something that one person offers, and then it's like, this is what I need at this time. And then I don't outgrow them, or you just need something different. And then maybe sometimes you cycle back around and you connect with them again. So I always have had coaches and mentors in my life. I'm not always an easy person to coach. So that's why I appreciate people who do know how to redirect me. But I would say that I look for qualities, because the coaching industry has gotten so big that there are a lot of people in it that don't necessarily have a good skill set, but there are a lot of people who do. So when you find people who are really good at coaching, it can just be a complete game changer. I would say one of my things that I look for, and just sort of I don't know, a pet peeve of mine, is that obviously mindset coaching is something that's kind of trendy and popular now, and it can be something that is so important. But I like people who do sort of almost like a wax on, wax off sort of thing, like in the Karate Kid, where he's teaching him one thing, but he doesn't realize he's working on this, and he's working, he thinks he's painting the fence, but he's really working on sparring or whatever. But with the mindset work, a lot of times nobody thinks they need to work on mindset, but everybody needs to work on mindset. So, what I like is when a coach just, if I'm distorting something or like twisting something, I like when they just get in there and they're like, this is what you're doing. Like, this is how you're distorting that. Here's another way of looking at it. And here are your choices versus, have you considered working on your mindset? Because to me, that's like, I'm automatically pumping the brakes. And, like nobody wants to be told they need to work on their mindset. So a good coach can get in there and work on your mindset without having to go through this whole, argument about, should we work on your mindset now? And I think that a lot of coaches know how to just get in there without coming up against that resistance. And of course, there's going to be resistance. It's just like part of working through discomfort. But I always appreciate coaches who can do that and can have that strong frame to not let me like dominate the conversation and go over here and continue to ruminate and twist and distort. I like when they can kind of get in there and be like, all right, we're moving this, we're steering this car the other direction.
Yes. What I've learned is learned that the mindset working with a coach is key.
Hmm.
That is, you got to have the right mindset, and
Yeah.
there's so many things that happen, and you might have been more effective in certain areas of your life, and now you're going to new levels, and you have to have someone to expose and uh, help you be aware of what is limiting you to be able to go to the next level, which is really key. So I'm glad that
Yeah.
you mentioned that the characteristics of a effective coach to really help you with the mindset is key, and that's what I learned in my experiences as well. When
Hmm.
it comes to professional development, what is a professional development experience that you experienced and thought was really beneficial, and also would encourage anyone that is in the work that you're doing to see if they can definitely work to attend?
So I think what's challenging for me as someone who offers professional development, as well as when I was when I go to professional development, is that we are still, just because of convenience and our lives are crazy and everything, is that we are very stuck in this lecture workshop model, and that has not shown to be very effective. So a lot of times when people come to professional development, and I know this just from being one that delivers it, a lot of times people want you to get into the tactics and the nitty gritty of things. But just like I was saying before, where you kind of have to think about the big picture of your service plan before you can figure out your silos, is that if you don't have the right mindset and you're not thinking about what you're doing in the right way, the tactics aren't going to matter, and that's not going to result in behavioral change. So what I have found is that effective professional development is really ongoing. And it needs to be where you get some information, you shift your way of thinking about one thing, and then you get something that you can go do right now in little bits at a time, and then come back and troubleshoot. And so that's really the most ideal, most effective model. The way that I have seen people do it in a way that's sort of a compromise between what people do often in the schools and the way that I'm trying to kind of reconcile the fact that a lot of times the way things are set up, it's just easier to do a day-long workshop, is that I try to focus on the big picture and shifting the way people think about their intervention, and giving them a little bit of something tangible and practical that they can think about, that they can use right now, but giving them a way to follow up with me afterwards. That is key. And that's where I've seen a lot of people make a big difference, because I think about people who maybe I saw their training, and it's not that I went and I changed my whole therapy practice or whatever after I saw them, but there was one thing that I was thinking, and it's like, it just changed my thinking about something. And maybe I didn't have a specific strategy that went with that right away, but it made me look at things differently. So a lot of times when you have those really short things, it does have to be about those mindset shifts. And then we can get to the tangible tactics, which of course are important too, but they just have to be structured in the right way. So really it's got to be about the shifts first, the why, and the rationale behind it. And then you can start getting into those tactics and ongoing. So yeah, ideally the way that I structure my things is that I like there to be some ongoing access to me and options for people to learn more and work with me, because I know that that's where I'm going to help them make the real changes.
Yeah, you're exactly right, and I believe in that methodology and philosophy as well. You know, that the ongoing support, and what we have seen in the past in professional development. You know, you have a company or a consultant comes in for the one day, and then there's no more support.
Yeah.
And you're not moving the needle, you're not making any progress. And then next year you're at the same beginning and starting point again, because it's not that ongoing support, which is definitely needed. So I'm glad that you have definitely mentioned that. What is a book that you're reading now in terms of helping you and supporting your growth?
Oh my gosh, I read so many books, so it's hard to pick, but let's see. Which one could I go with that I've read recently? Um, so I'm going to go with Band of Brothers. Well, okay, so Beyond Band of Brothers. I mentioned this one a couple times, because this one is it's really about leadership when you think about the themes of the book, and it's really about how when you have like something in front of you that you're working on, you don't always realize the impact that you make on other things, other people, until way later. In Beyond Band of Brothers, that's actually Dick Winters, one of the people that was featured in Band of Brothers, wrote another book. He wrote a book about his experience with it, and it just covers a different angle and shares some additional context that wasn't in Band of Brothers. And what's really interesting is that there were a couple scenes where, like, if you watched it, for example, all you see is just chaos. But Major Winters shared some scenarios where it's like, this is what was going on at the time and I didn't know it, but I was impacting these people over here on the beach, for example. And he got letters from people later on that were like, what you did saved my life, and I wouldn't be here if it wasn't for you. And there was no way that he had any idea about what he was doing and the impact that it had. So that's really left an impression on me, because there's so many examples of that in that story. And then the other thing that really came out to me with that is just the idea of de facto leadership, which is what my brand is about, where it's a lot of times when you are working in a system that has this whole hierarchy, a lot of times someone who's in a position where they report to someone directly, and sometimes they have to lead up to the people who are reporting to them directly, or sometimes they have to just step into a leadership role that's beyond their job title just to make sure that they get things done. And that's a lot of times what helps them to emerge and level up in their career. And so that's something else that stood out. And that's, one of my favorite parts of that story, and a lot of other things. And I see examples of that in education all the time. And that's what I encourage the teachers, the therapists that I work with to do, because a lot of times they don't feel like they're in a leadership role, but I want them to start shifting their thinking and realize that they are.
Well, very good. So on the screen, just for time, we do have a link or information about how to get to your website and be able to learn more about the work that you do and also the services. So I want you to share at this period of time with the audience about the work that you're doing and for your company, and also about your podcast as well.
Yeah, so I do have some programs that are specifically for speech pathologists and people who are working with literacy interventions. One of those programs, the main one, is called Language Therapy Advanced Foundations, and that program helps speech pathologists create a framework for their language therapy. But I also have the School of Clinical Leadership, which is a program that helps related service providers. So this would be anybody who's in an interventionist role. So a speech pathologist, psychologist, social worker, counselor. Really, it could include teachers as well, or even people who are in some kind of a supervisor role, but helps people in that related services position to design executive functioning support for their teams. So I give them the support that they need to figure out what they need to do in their intervention sessions, but also how they can take on a leadership role and get their team on board with that and start training and coaching other people to make sure that the support is getting embedded across the day, so that they are seeing students take skills from their sessions and generalize it across the day. And also so that we can make sure that we are providing that proactive support from an academic and a social emotional standpoint. And so that is the School of Clinical Leadership. And then De Facto Leaders is the podcast where I do cover a number of topics that are relevant to what I offer in my programs, but it's also much broader as far as just figuring out how to help people who are in education, in those therapy positions, in those teaching positions, aspiring leaders and people who are already in those leadership positions to work together as a team. I do dive into things like language literacy and executive functioning, but I also talk broader about leadership and reform as well. So that is the De Facto Leaders podcast.
Very good. And again, on the screen right this period of time is the website to be able to get and be able to follow Dr. Karen Dudek Brannon and her work. It's drkarendudekbrannon.com /blog, BLOG, and then there /. And once you go to that site, all of the information is right there. So, Dr. Brannon, we're going to take a pause so I can recognize our sponsor, and then we'll come back with our final thoughts. So again, I would like to say thank you to Glad Eyes Apparel. They are a proud sponsor of the principal's office. Glad Eyes Apparel offers a wide range of Christian-themed merchandise, joggers, jewelry, tumblers, and more. And their products are made from high-quality materials, ensuring they are comfortable and durable for everyday wear. With their stylish and empowering designs, you can show off your faith and love for Christ. You shop now and discover the perfect Christian themed merchandise for you. And the way that you can order your products and services from Glad Eyes, you can go to their website, which I'll put on the screen here, gladeyesapparel.com. And I would say so thankful for Gladys Asafison, who's the CEO of Glad Eyes Apparel, for being our sponsor for this broadcast. So I'm going to bring back to the show Dr. Karen Brannon, and we are going to get some final thoughts. Dr. Brannon, this show is aired and broadcast amongst various stakeholders, parents, students, teachers, those that are part of child study teams, speech pathologists, of course, school administration, superintendents, and board members. And I'd like to, as we close out for this episode, if you can just share some final words or thoughts that you would like to share to a particular stakeholder or to educators worldwide.
Oh man, there's so many different places that I could go with that. But I would say that I think that there is this perception when you are in, regardless of what stakeholder you are, whether you're the parent and you're sitting on one end of the table and you've got the school team member, the therapist who's making a recommendation for your child, or whether you are a teacher or a therapist and you're asking your school administrator for something, or you're the school administrator and you're asking the school board for something. There's this perception that, like the other person has all the power and that you don't have any of the power. And so that's why I always encourage people to really form alliances, because you do have choices, you do have options. And when you work together and you see yourself as a part of this team, that's where you can start to make a difference and start chipping away at these things. So I always encourage people to, rather than seeing these relationships as like, I've got to convince this person of something, it's how can we work together to make this happen and get on the same page? And I really think that the way that change needs to happen in education needs to come from that way. How can we all work together? And just realizing that everybody has someone else that they report to. It's easy to think the other person has all the control, but that's not the case. They have constraints too, but the only way that you can work through those constraints is to figure out how to use your resources, and people and relationships can be one of the best resources that you have.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Brannon, for being on the show. And thank you for those words of encouragement, and also everything that you have expressed during this broadcast has definitely been very informative for me and also for those that are doing this work. And I thank you for sharing the services that you offer through your company that are going to be very important to have strong, effective child study teams across the country, and also impact internationally as well. So again, thank you for being on the show. And I would say, I just want to look up on the screen one more time, her website, drkarendudekbrannon.com/blog/please visit her site, learn more about her and the great work that she is doing. And I'd like to thank everyone who has tuned in for this episode of the Principal's Office. Once again, we had an opportunity to highlight an educational stakeholder that's making a significant impact. And I want you to ask and encourage you to share this broadcast with those in part of your community and network. Offer comments. The feedback is greatly appreciated. And tune in next Tuesday at 3 p.m. Eastern Standard Time for another exciting episode of the Principal's Office, as we bring on another educational stakeholder who is making an impact in education. Thank you very much. Have a wonderful afternoon. Thank you, Dr. Brannon.
Thank you.